Thank you. Well, now Professor Michta, but I would like everybody to introduce himself.
Andrew Michta, Wilson Center. Thank you very much. I was struck by something Kobieracki said towards the end, and so it's not really a question, but more a comment, and you spoke of getting some foundation, some bearings on rebuilding trust and getting the relationship with the Russians going. And it strikes me that one of the most important things we need to do in this is to tone down what I call the kind of excessive mood swings. And when it comes to Russia, it's almost like the flavor du jour, and I'm addressing what Francois said. One day the Russian tanks are about to pour across into Latvia. The next, we have tons of useless pipelines coming up because the Poles are pouring water into some potential gas deposits. Well, before we declare Poland another Qatar, I think we should take a step back, take a deep breath. The fact that my country is beginning to get a semblance of energy policy for the first time in 30 years, which means we finally have some permits for nuclear power plants, we're looking at some coal use and things like that, indeed will improve our overall energy situation. But that American gas will not be liquefied and delivered to Germany, you know, across the Atlantic Ocean, so that the Russian pipelines can all of a sudden be rendered meaningless. Plus, even if our Polish friends are successful in getting Chevron and company to get that gas out online, it's going to be pretty pricey stuff, and we still have networks to be developed. The reason I say all of this is because it seems to me that we won't get to what Adam is recommending, that is some serious discussion on how to build a relationship with the Russians, unless we get a more balanced view of the kind of consistent Russian policy and don't either dismiss them or demonize them and keep going in the kind of back and forth way. The second question is about China, and once again, I sense a bit of kind of navel gazing in my own country when it comes to China. That is, there are almost two narratives of China. There's the China pre-Great Recession and there's China post-Great Recession. The fact that we kept accumulating debt at breathtaking speed before the bubble burst did not seem to have much of an impact on China-America images and great globalization and the kind of level of satisfaction. Very few people talked about containing China, Chinese threat, you know, the power shifts, et cetera, et cetera. All of a sudden, the flavor du jour in my own country is the Chinese threat is rising. And at a risk of sounding a bit, I don't know, maybe condescending, that seems to be seeping out of Washington now into policy discourse all over the world. And China is the one that's going to redefine everything. China is a rising power. We are at the cusp of multipolarity. I'm not questioning that. I am just saying perhaps we should be a bit sotto voce about it before we start declaring, you know, a gigantic fault lines emerging comparable to what happened in 1990. And the third point, and that goes directly to Francois, I actually used to share your view that we are, as NATO becomes hollowed out, that we will shift more to bilateralism. In other words, that we will always kind of skin a cat the way we want and work that way. I would submit to you that we tried this in the Bush era, and we discovered this to be very inefficient. And the reason why we expend so much energy on trying to shore up NATO is because bilateralism now is recognized, I would argue, in Washington as a fallback position, not a default position. So I would like, again, to bring this into the discussion. And my larger plea would be, when we talk about partnerships, let's get a more balanced view of what's across the boundary to the east. So that Adam's plea can actually begin to function. And at the same time, let's take a larger global view. Yes, we're a leveraged superpower. You know, you've got a 12 trillion and a half of national debt. You're looking at deficits of 1.4 trillion, whatever the latest is. But don't write us off yet. I mean, we still have some gas left in the tank. And I think it's only based on those assumptions that we can come up with some way to build a strategic concept that serves us all. Thank you. Sorry that this is so long.
Thank you. Francois, do you want to respond?
For the set of remarks you have made, and I agree with what you said about bilateralism in particular. What I was trying to do in my remarks was to look at how the Russians could be looking at their options in the post-financial crisis world. And the post-shale gas world, if I can put it that way. In a sense, the Russians are going to have to answer two questions. The first is, if they want to modernize their economy, which they appear to want to do, and for fairly obvious reasons, because being a petro-oligarchy doesn't appear to be a winning proposition, then you're going to look at how the Chinese did it. Now, the Chinese model, as we all know, was not particularly democratic, but there was one aspect of it which could be readily replicated by Russia, and that is, from 1980 onwards, China firmly became, in strategic terms, a status quo power. After having waged its last military conflict against Vietnam in 1979, China decided we need absolute peace and tranquility with the rest of the world if we want to succeed in our economic modernization, and to keep defense spending at low levels. And this is what happened. Russia has not yet come to that conclusion. It spends as a percentage of its GDP on defense more than any of the G8 countries, including China, as a percentage of GDP. And of course, Russia, as Ron Asmus pointed out, still has elements of revisionism. And we saw this with the conflict, we saw this with Abkhazia, we saw this with Southern Ossetia, etc. So if they're serious about modernization, will Moscow be willing to review its basic security policy posture? Will it be willing to do that? If it is, that makes a very different relationship with Russia. It doesn't make them allies, it doesn't make them friends. China has not become an ally or a friend because of that. But it does certainly change the manner in which we relate to each other. And the second question, which is not without some interface with the previous one, is that from the Russian perspective, what is happening in the field of energy is pretty catastrophic. What counts for them is not the fact that we are going to continue to need to buy some gas from Russia. Yes, we will continue to need to buy some gas from Russia. Yes, some of the pipelines will continue to be useful. But the price with America being removed as a customer for natural gas, which is now the prospect, you have a completely different price structure in terms of what is Russia's exports have the same structure as under the Soviet Union. 3/4 is export of oil and gas. This has not changed. Half of it more or less is gas, half of it more or less is oil. The gas component is in very serious trouble. And there again, the Russians will have to ask themselves the question, to what extent do we really try to modernize our economy?